Hello, and welcome to Fusion Writing, where building character meets creating structure. This is our map day, and that means that we're going to get down to some of the interesting details about the topic that we have under discussion for this week. Well, I won't take up any of Victoria's time. I'll send it right on over to her. Victoria?
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the map. As I mentioned in the compass section, we're going to take a further look at a little bit of the theory behind fiction and the ways that you can build out a story. Now, last week, just for a quick recap, we talked about conflict-driven story. So you have some kind of a challenge or a conflict, and that drives to a crisis. Then your character fights through the crisis, wins the battle, and that ends the story and lands them in a new world. Pretty typical story that's hardwired into all of us. But there is a complete opposite way of writing stories that don't have that drive towards a climax or a crisis. And that's non-conflict driven story. So what does that look like? Well, you always begin by showing your character in the world that they exist in, because you need to ground that reader in some kind of reality. So you're going to give a look at the current situation and how it exists for your character. But this is where things are written a little differently. Instead of some kind of inciting incident or some kind of bang or pow or something happens, some major conflict that sets things in motion, a non-conflict driven story tends to be a quieter story, a more meditative story. Now, it doesn't mean that there can't be good tension and suspense, because there certainly can. But this kind of story is driven more by gaining insights or making discoveries. So as long as you hold those two terms in the back of your mind as you're writing, character gains some sort of insight or character makes some sort of discovery, and it's the drive towards that discovery that is the tension that pulls the reader through, then you know you're on the right track. So what else could that look like? Well, from the very beginning, when you have that point that sets them in motion, sets them on the course of the story, they're going to be making observations. This is a terrific use of the internal monologue, or perhaps a dialogue between a main and a side character as they're figuring out or working through what this situation is. Again, it doesn't mean that they're tripping over dead bodies or things are blowing up, but something is nagging at them, something that they need to work their way through. Hence, either an internal monologue to work it through or dialogue with another character. Or you could always go the Hamlet route and have a soliloquy where they're speaking out loud about their problem to the ether and working it out as they talk to themselves. That's a handy trick too. So then after working through whatever this situation is, whatever this challenge is, they come to some kind of insight. That observation, that moment of discovery is where you have a shift in the story. Usually it's just past the midpoint. So let's say you're writing a 20-page story. Somewhere around pages 9, 10, 11 is where you're going to make this shift. And that's the thing that brings them into a new perspective or a new world. So this kind of story is much quieter. Often you think of it as family or relationship dynamics, or it can even be something internal. A novel that comes to mind, which is one of my favorites, is the novel Eat, Pray, Love, which was turned into a very successful movie. But that's a really good example of a woman using introspection and going on a journey to several different countries in order to discover her own true happiness and her own sense of self. So that's the kind of quiet story that we're talking about. Doesn't mean that you can't have drama and tension, but all of those discoveries and insights are taking place internally. Finally, you end at some kind of reflection or sometimes a meditative moment where in retrospect, that character is looking back over that journey that they've taken and they're coming to some kind of lesson or into some new reality because of the journey that they've taken. So as Kathleen starts to talk with you about this mystery final character trait, I want you to think about how could that play into the kind of insight that a discovery character is making, right? How do they arrive at this new reality using a non-conflict driven journey? That's what I want you to hold in your mind as we start talking about our final character trait. In the end, you get to decide what your story is. Are you going to sprinkle in some conflict and some tension? Are you going to keep it insightful and quiet? Or are you going to land somewhere in the middle and use pieces of both? That's my final suggestion for a great trick, is to maybe have that quiet story, but as a subplot, maybe you have something that's more conflicty or conflict driven, just to add a little spice and flavor. Again, you're the writer, so you get to choose. But hold those ideas in your mind as you're doing those zero and first drafts, so that you can pull from your toolkit and choose the tools that best serve to tell the story that you want to tell. With that, I will throw it back over to Kathleen, and let's dive into that final character trait.
Oh, Victoria, thank you so much. I love the non-conflict driven story, and I have the belief that every action drama should also have a non-conflict driven story as a backstory or a side story, because that's part of how we get to relate our own lives to what's going on. We're not going to be out there flying helicopters and chasing bad guys clinging to the landing gear of the helicopter, but we all face a journey of discovery of who we are in and of ourselves, which brings us to our last character position, the long-awaited base trait. The base traits, or the base character position, are the traits that are most totally the person themselves. This is who your character is. You don't need to make decisions anymore. This is just who that character is. You can think of examples in literature so well. How about Sam Gamgee's in For Loyalty? Just no matter what Frodo puts him through, Sam Gamgee's is loyal. It's just who he is as part of his base trait. And these are the things that we can draw on for our character that helps distinguish the role of that character in the story very, very solidly, because that is going to be, those kinds of things are almost never brought into question. However, it plays a role in two different kinds of dynamic story. The long form novel, the epic novel, will take a character trait all the way from the pinnacle position through to the wing, through to the rudder, and then in the anchor position where it should be solid, it's going to be given one more massive test with a massive shaking temptation to break through the anchor. And these can come in two flavors. One flavor is the reward that is so enticing that your character's eyes are popping and he's almost ready to drop everything for this great thing. And the other is a horrible double bind where the character feels that, oh my gosh, I have to abandon this thing hard fought into the anchor position, or else somebody's going to die or some horrible thing is going to happen. And that after that final test, when the character either resists that horrible temptation or finds a fabulous way out that pushes through and saves both, then the character drops into the base position and becomes part of who that character is, and they lived happily ever after. So that's how base can be dynamic. There's a sadder story too that I don't like to write, but it's totally possible, and that's where you show a character crumbling. You first show him taking into a decision making something that you know is going to take him down a bad path. He doesn't realize it yet. He thinks he's actually choosing something that might be kind of good, or at least he's convincing himself that there's some good in it, but it's of course what he wants in it from a temptation standpoint. So then he goes into the wing with that one, and with that, something that used to be in the anchor now comes up into the rudder, and now he's given a worse temptation, a temptation to really make a choice for the dark side. And when he makes that choice, boom, that goes up into the wing, and the other one that was in the wing goes into the pinnacle, and that base trait starts creaking into the anchor position. And at the end, you even get his base trait, the thing that used to be the most solid about himself, and you show that crumbling. Blah. Oh, I don't like that kind of story. But that helps you understand how those traits work, because the traits make these gradual moves if they move at all. Most of the time in your story, this will almost always be true of your secondary characters and will absolutely always be true of your bit characters, your minor characters. The character trait is what the character trait is. After all, that's our reality. We generally are who we are. We make big transitions maybe in our teen years, maybe in our midlife crisis. Maybe when we finally settle into retirement, we make another round of changes. But for the most part of our lives, we are who we are, and our characters are who we are. But if you set your main character off on a journey, I hope, of emotional growth, then set that as the backstory with or without action to go with it. Now you have the makings of a satisfying drama. Now, as we wind up all these character positions, we have to ask ourselves, well, wait a minute, would it be fair to say that a villain has evil as a base trait? And the answer to that is no. And here's why. We have to have an axis of directionality on the character traits. And what we do, we try not to, as fiction writers, we try not to put morality on it. We could say one end is virtue and the other end is vice. But what we're trying to do is keep our freedom as writers, as authors, to portray the world however we want. That's how you get to experiment with different ideas. What if morality were constructed differently? So we don't want to use virtue and vice just because that can set up biases in our thinking as authors. So instead, we have a metric that turns out to be far more neutral and it resolves things. You don't have to pull things up to a value judgment. Is this good or bad? And that is, does the character trait, decisions in accordance with that character trait, lead to more chaos in your story, in the life of your character, or does it lead to more stability in the life of your character? So now think about how that helps with, you have a character trait where a character is, do I take on the adventure or am I going to put my head in the sand? I've been invited on an epic journey. Well, if the character makes a trait that reduces the chaos in his life, well, your story isn't going to even get off the ground. But still, we know that that's the anchor position. And so that gives us an objective way of describing these things. Well, what a villain does is a villain throws chaos everywhere he goes. So what is most central and most definitional about the villain is that he has these traits, these key traits in his pinnacle position. And that would be things like kindness, loyalty, sincerity, honesty. All of those things are just not in his sight. And so what does he have in his base? Probably has some things in his base traits as well. Many villains have orderliness in the base trait. A large number of them have self-control as a base trait. They are very, very directed, very, very purposeful in their evil. So just think of the traits in terms of, do they stabilize or do they destabilize? Stability, instability. And then you'll understand how to place the character traits on your chart. And remember, it's the movement that makes the story arc. All right. Victoria, what do you have to wind us up?
Oh man, this is such good stuff. This is such great material that you can use not only to figure out the course of your story, but beautifully layer on those different aspects of characters. Just like Kathleen said, you can use bits as side characters, as ancillary, tertiary characters, maybe just to add a little bit of spice or a little bit of conflict. I mean, guys, this stuff is gold. If you just hold in your mind the story that you have, that little nugget of story, and then start to think about how can you toggle these pieces around to build out a really great character, you can't go wrong. I mean, the character traits are so solid. You absolutely can't go wrong. Just start playing with them. And then come on over to LiLLiPub and join us in Fusion Writing, where we meet every Saturday at 1 p.m. Central on our Zoom link. And we talk about our stories, and we talk about the characters that we're writing and the stories that we're developing and projects that we want to work on and share. It's just a great opportunity to get our feedback on the things that you're working on while you have the luxury of having us, because this won't last forever. But right now we've got a great little group. So come on over and join us, and let's talk about the character traits and the story that you want to write.
Thank you, Victoria. That's right, LiLLiPub.org. If you can afford a premium coffee a couple of times a month, you can afford LiLLiPub. We're on that price level, not too expensive. And boy, oh boy, when you consider the quality of attention to your writing, the thoughtfulness that will go into to helping guide you and get you going. And you're talking about treating a friend to a cup of premium coffee. Good grief. You cannot imagine the value that is open to you right now, as Victoria said, while we're small and while we're at this stage where we can afford to give you that level of attention. So come on over, lillipub.org. See you there.
Next
Bye-bye.
week.